My name is John Brodigan. I'm legal counsel for League of Women Voters and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, and I've been quite involved with fair elections in Portland over the last couple of years. I use he, him pronouns. Just for background, this November will mark 25 years since the historic vote to approve public funding of state campaigns in Maine, the first in the nation. So Portland has been electing its state legislators using the Maine Clean Election Act now for 11 consecutive successful election cycles. The Clean Election program at the state level is optional, but it is significant to note that Portland has the highest participation rate of any major municipality in the state. In 2010, some Portland voters wanted to bring a public funding option to Portland municipal races for mayor, city council, school board. And those voters saw that these races in Portland have seen increasing cost, increasing attention from business interests and political organizations alike, some of them very well funded, and occasional questions about the unwanted role of private money in these races. And people began to ask what can be done. So in 2010, the Portland Charter Commission deferred on the question, though there was strong support. Now, fast forward several years and we see the emergence of a joint effort to bring ranked choice voting and public funding to Portland. This was an effort championed by many everyday residents of the city, also by Fair Elections Portland. And in 2019, that effort submitted over 6,000 valid signatures for each proposal. This was the most signatures on a municipal ballot question petition in Maine history. The charter amendment proposal for ranked choice voting went on the ballot in 2020, and voters readily approved it at that time. The charter amendment for public funding has been the subject of litigation, and at this date has not been yet been sent to the voters. The important point, though, is that the push for public funding resulted in the formation of the 2021-22 Charter Commission in Portland. So the mandate of the Charter Commission is, of course, unlimited, but the drive or the impetus that created it and brought this group together was the proposal to institute a form of public funding and to lock it into the charter where it would not be subject to political gamesmanship. Now, there is not just one way to do public funding. Over the years since 1996, different varieties of public funding programs have been implemented around the country, and that brings us to this webinar. States and municipalities have taken the idea and they've run with it. Maine's, of course, has been a resounding success. Other programs have also brought great benefits to their communities. In particular, the nation has watched as programs in New York City and Seattle have emerged, both successful and very well-run programs, and you'll hear more about them shortly. In any event, I hope the information here today will help you assess which approach is best suited for Portland. And first off tonight, someone who has been at the center of this movement for a quarter of a century and headed up a national organization dedicated to this cause is Nick Neihart. Nick has been a longstanding champion of democracy-centered, inclusive, equitable reforms. And I have to say, I've known Nick for a long time. No one knows the whole landscape of public funding programs, their advantages and disadvantages better than Nick Neihart. Portland and the Charter Commission, you're very fortunate to have him here today. So I will turn it over to Nick.
It's great to be here. It's exciting to see city officials, the commission, really considering this. And given the circumstances of these days, thank goodness for Zoom that we can all get together and share information. The administrators on this call are really experts on the inner workings, nitty-gritty, how they work from the inside, what you have to do to make them successful from an implementation point of view. I want to thank John and Anna. The Pro-Democracy Alliance between Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the Maine chapter of the League is an innovative sort of construct and is a model for other people in the country. And I just want to say that for those of you in Maine, that John and Anna are leaders among state and local policy folks around the country. I've worked, as John said, I've worked with people for almost 30 years now around the country doing this. And John and Anna are just gems. And I think people in Maine should appreciate that. When I want to understand from the policy design perspective, are these policies achieving their goals? From the reformers' point of view, John and Anna have great knowledge and great advice, and I'd like to talk to them. So they and what they've built in Maine are just gems. So I hope sometimes you see them every day, you don't appreciate that, but I will say from the outside, they're terrific. So I want to talk about two things. One is the history and roots of the three small donor systems that are sort of around and being used. I want to talk about a little bit, because we have great panelists, about what each of them does, but just a sentence on each. I also want to talk about how they all can achieve some of the same goals. And I think as we've seen them over the years, we've seen what they can do and what they have in common, because in many ways, even though the details are different, what they accomplish is much the same, and they're successful in addressing the same series of goals. So I want to roll back the clock about 30 years to the early 1990s. People at that time had become increasingly concerned about the role of money at the federal level, even with Watergate reforms in place. But there was a feeling that, geez, elections are costing more and big money is running the show. But less progress was being made in reform. So the reformers weren't keeping up at the federal level with the amount of money and end arounds on some of the existing laws. And at the same time, people engaged on policy and politics at the state level, in city halls and state capitals, were getting more and more troubled about the role of money at that level too, which you think is more homegrown, more grassroots. But there was a concern rising in the 80s into the early 90s that money was a problem at the state and local level as well. And in the early 1990s, there were some grants made nationally to state and local groups to say, okay, what's going on? You've got this sense, but what is actually happening? And so there were a series of parallel studies, I think done in more than 20 states, probably 24 or so. And they found, almost everywhere, two things were happening. Yes, campaigns were getting more expensive. And increasingly, the money that lawmakers collected for their campaigns was coming from wealthy individuals, was skewing that way, and from political organizations, PACs, that had an interest in legislative policy. So that was really putting a pull on public policy, and people were beginning to see that. And so the flip side of that was the voice of everyday people was getting drowned out. And for candidates, the lesson was increasingly, if you want to run for office, it's important to build relationships, not just with your constituents, but pay attention to donors and the lobbying interests. So all these studies around the country in the early 90s came to that general conclusion. So the next question is, well, what can we do about this? And at that time, I was working with a regional group in New England that's how I got to know folks in Maine originally and watched the pioneering work happen in Maine. So people began to develop policy alternatives. And the basic idea was, what reforms would make it so that you were dependent on your constituents for your campaign cash, the everyday people who you're supposed to serve. Could you create policy reforms that would say, depend on those people for your campaign cash, and not just the people who could write you a big check of some kind? So the answers that people over the past couple of decades have come up with are three basic models. And each of them augments small individual contributions with public funds. They do it slightly different ways, but what they have in common is that they're incentivizing candidates to reach out to ordinary voters to secure their campaign war chest, instead of going and calculating, how do I appeal to big donors and the moneyed special interests? So the three types are the clean election system, which you all know about from Maine, but that system is still working in Arizona, in Connecticut, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Then there's the matching fund system, best exemplified by New York City, which is, was sort of the big one that won in one of the biggest places in the country early on. It's been around, I think, since the 1980s. I'll be corrected on that later, I'm sure. But we're also seeing that system in the newer systems that are being won. So Washington, D.C. just started a system like that. There are a number of counties in Maryland. I think the city of Baltimore also is included in that. There's a new system going into effect in New York State, which draws on the New York model, and I think in some ways even leverages small donations more than any of the models that's passed. It has not yet gone into effect. In two other big cities, Los Angeles and San Francisco, they're also matching fund systems. And they're being worked on and advocated in other places. And then, of course, the Freedom to Vote bill, the Democratic sponsored omnibus that they're searching for some Republican votes for, that Joe Manchin just said yes to, the public financing piece of that in the new reformed, slightly slimmed down version is also a matching fund system. So that's the lead proposal for Congress. And then finally, the model of these is the Seattle system, which we'll hear about later, the democracy voucher system. And that's now in the final cycle of its 3-cycle phase of it. It's basically brought in and expanded. And so it's running at full speed in this cycle for the 2021 municipal elections in Seattle. And René was the startup administrator of that and is going to talk about that. So just quickly, how they leverage the money in Maine, you get a set number of $5 contributions and boom, you get a big grant. In New York City, you meet certain qualifications by raising small donations, and then you're eligible to get an 8-to-1 match this year for the first time. So a $10 contribution is worth $90 per candidate. Makes a candidate want to sit down more with people who can give $10, $20, $50. And then finally, under Seattle's voucher systems, every resident gets $100. So every resident is bought into the system because you're given coupons essentially that you turn in for campaign cash. So that's the skinny sort of on how each of them enables ordinary citizens to be the people a candidate depends on. You'll hear a lot more about the details and the ins and outs shortly. What they have in common, though, is each of them substantially increases the incentives for candidates to talk to their constituents, to spend time with those folks, because that act alone will bring in a significant campaign cash. There's a way to do it without courting wealthy donors. Candidates wind up bringing in their money from the everyday people. So small donors are more reflective of the population at large when it comes to race, ethnicity, age, gender, and income than the top donors. So it adds to a real reflectivity that the top donors don't have. And that's what you want democracy to be about. They all expand the possibility for new non-traditional candidates to run for office. People who don't have connections to wealthy people or big dollar PACs can now run robust campaigns that are competitive and can be successful. They all reduce the chances of money corruption because the big donors are simply less important. So no one is going to say, geez, if you give me that $10, here's the great policies I'll pass. Do we have a deal, right? That's different than when you talk with someone who says, I could be very helpful to your campaign, reaching out to my network, but I want to make sure you're aligned with me on policy. So it's just a different kind of set of conversations you have with the people you depend on financially. They're all optional. So no candidate is forced to participate. That makes them constitutional. So as much as the Supreme Court has rolled back regulations for campaign finance, public financing is still okay by the Supreme Court. And so it's a tool that you can use that is available now constitutionally that the court has smiled about rather than frowned upon. They're relatively inexpensive. I did a look at all of them, the ones we're talking, the main ones. I'm sorry, the ones used around the country that are sort of exemplars. The cost on an annualized budget basis is less than 1/20% of the budget. And that's just the grant total. There's a little extra for administration, but even so, you're looking at considerably less than 1/10% of the entity's budget, the overall budget. So they're inexpensive. And finally, before I segue to the other panelists, I just want to make this point that in all of them, solid administration is really important. So as reformers design these, you got to include a robust, effective administrative system that both can police the system and make sure candidates are doing this on the up and up and has that power, and it has to have some independence from politics. But they also have, key stakeholders. The public, it has to be reputable, has to seem as being functioning efficiently, and that candidates aren't being able to cheat the system. And then you have two other kinds of stakeholders, the candidates, right? Candidates got to like to use the system. So you want friendly, easy to use, friendly administrators also. And then the people who give to it, they have to understand that giving is easy and they can do it. It has to work smoothly for the donors too. So I'd say that's one final thing that the most successful systems have achieved, which is smooth, thoughtful administration. So those are the things that I think all these systems have in common, and they are important things to think about. So there's a lot of choices to make. They need to be made well, and you can hear about how these systems, the different systems work with the next bunch of panelists.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. That was a terrific setup for us. Let's go to Maine, and let me just introduce Jonathan Wayne and Emma Burke. Jonathan has been the Executive Director of the Commission on Governmental Ethics here in Maine since 2003. Before that, he was a staff attorney for the New York City Campaign Finance Board. And Emma Burke has been a candidate registrar at the Ethics Commission for about 8 years. And she's a born and raised Mainer with a BA in political science and criminology from USM and her master's degree in justice studies from UNH. She lives in Portland with her cat Cuddles and her partner David. And I had to say that last part.
Yeah, notice the cat comes first too.
We are very fortunate to have a very good ethics commission in Maine. They really get the credit for being the steady hand that's helped to transform the great idea of clean elections into a practical functioning system that everybody now has confidence in. And I'm just really delighted to turn it over to Jonathan and Emma to share this next part.
Great. Thank you very much, John. And it's really nice to see familiar faces. And thanks very much for including us. So I'm Jonathan Wayne. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and then turn it over to Emma for her to talk a little bit more about, at a high level, the nuts and bolts. Our program is voluntary, like Nick said. It's available to candidates for governor and also for state representative and state senate. And it was adopted in the 1990s through a citizen initiative. So we've been administering it through 11 legislative elections and 5 elections for governor. I've been here since 2003, so I missed the first couple of elections, but I've been around since then. So the way it works is that candidates qualify for a basic level of Maine Clean Election Act funding through going out to registered voters in their geographical area and collecting $5 qualifying contributions. And if they collect more than the minimum number of those $5 contributions, then they qualify to receive money from the state. And in our election system, these are partisan elections. So the candidates for governor and for the legislature receive a payment for the primary and a payment for the general. And they do this in January. Well, the legislative candidates do this in January through April of the election year. And then once they qualify for funding in April, then it's a system of full public funding. So it differs a little bit from the 2 other programs that you have we're presenting today, in that the public financing here in Maine for legislative and gubernatorial candidates actually replaces traditional campaign contributions entirely, except for these small $5 qualifying contributions. So that's how we fund it. It's a voluntary program. We've had about 60 to 70, sometimes as many as 80% of the candidates for the legislature participate in the program. And so once they start receiving the public funding, absolutely every dollar they spend needs to be paid for with public funding that they receive from our office. They are not allowed to spend their own money, and they're not allowed to accept any contributions. So that is if you like the sound of, you hear good things about the Maine program, you just need to understand it's a different way for everyday people to interact with their candidates, because they can only give those $5 checks. Let me stop right there, and I'll turn it over to Emma to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of what the candidates experience.
Okay, so I'm just going to basically run you through the process of if a candidate, typically for the state legislature, wants to become a Clean Election candidate, what they have to do to get there, and then once they are a Clean Election Act candidate, what their life looks like a little bit. I'm going to go fast just to keep it quick and within the time limit. I do want to say, if there's anyone on the panel or anyone out there watching who has questions or concerns, feel free to email me after this, and I'm happy to answer any questions I can. So the first step for any candidate who wants to be a clean election candidate is they have to register with our office, and they also have to sign a special form called the Declaration of Intent. The Declaration of Intent is an affirmation by that candidate that they understand the rules and regulations of the Maine Clean Election Act program, and they will abide by those. Once we have those forms, once they're registered and we have that form, they can start collecting the qualifying contributions, or QCs, as we call them for short, provided it's January 1st or after of the election year. And they can also start collecting seed money. Seed money is the only period of time and the only funds that clean election candidates are allowed to collect and spend that are privately raised. This is to help them get their campaign off the ground while they're working on collecting those QCs. They are very limited in what they can collect. It's $100 max from individual contributors, meaning the donations have to come from actual people. They cannot come from businesses, organizations, PACs, etc. House candidates can raise a max of 1,000. Senate candidates can raise a max of 3,000 of that seed money. So then they also start collecting qualifying contributions. As has been noted, the qualifying contributions, or QCs, are donations of $5 from registered voters in the candidate's district. They do not have to be registered of the same party as the candidate. They just have to be registered to vote in that district. House candidates have to collect at least 60. Senate candidates have to collect at least 175. Gubernatorial candidates have to collect 3,200. For legislative candidates, those are due by April 20th of the election year. So they usually, starting in January, they have close to 5 months to collect those. QCs can come in 4 different types. There's 3 types, what we call material QCs, which are personal checks via cash or money order. And then contributors can also donate QCs online using the Commission's QC website. If a candidate is collecting them via one of those first 3 material methods, the contributor has to sign a special form that is designed and distributed by our office that all contributors have to sign, and it's an affirmation by the contributor that they understand what they're donating to and what the funds are going to. And they also must sign the payment method, which means the check or the money order. If they give via cash, they have to sign a special cash QC affirmation form. Jonathan, we should probably work on shortening that name every time I say it out loud. So they have to sign that. And so once they get at least 60 or 175 of those, they submit those materials to our office, the Ethics Commission. Every single qualifying contribution is thoroughly reviewed. There is not one we skip over. Every part of every QC is reviewed to make sure that it meets all of the requirements of a QC, such as it's from a registered voter, that it's personal funds of the individual, all signatures match. Basically, there's nothing going on that makes me think that this QC was fraudulently or invalidly given. Once we certify someone as a clean election candidate, then we authorize a payment to them. As Jonathan alluded to, the payments are based on what election they're currently in, be it primary, general, or special, and if they have opponents in those elections. That decides, as well as which office they're running for, decides how much money they get in a payment from us in public funds at that time. As Jonathan said, those public funds are the only thing they're allowed to spend at this point on anything campaign related. They cannot take really any donations of service or goods of any kinds, except for a few exceptions. And they are also somewhat restricted in how those funds can be spent. Anything that's a traditional campaign expense, they certainly can purchase signs, advertising, if they need staff, things like that. Things they cannot do, you can't pay your spouse to work on your campaign for you. You can't pay your rent or your utilities if you're campaigning, if your campaign headquarters is your house, which if you're in Maine, 99% of the time you are. So things like that, they're very reasonable restrictions for the most part. But it is restricted, and 20 to 25% of Candidates are randomly audited at the end of the election. All gubernatorial candidates are audited, and any unspent funds have to be returned after the election. And sometimes we also have folks sell equipment that they've purchased with clean election funds and return those proceeds to the commission as well. Those are for more expensive things like computers, tablets, printers, things like that. All clean election candidates have to file campaign finance reports, just like everyone else. They have to report every single penny of expenses. And overall, they're held to the same standard as all other candidates as far as how we review their activity and making sure their reporting is accurate.
Great.
Okay, I think I went through that really fast, but I think that's pretty much
That was great.
everything.
That was very good.
Don,
Yes.
if I could just add one more thing. We are really eager to help anyone in the Portland City Clerk's office, anyone on the commission on the Charter Commission that we can. And I just want to say that the accountability functions that Nick mentioned are really key as you consider, the staffing that's available. You want to make sure that the candidates are qualifying the right way, because some candidates will cut corners, regrettably, when public subsidies are available to them. You want to be more proactive, I think, than a lot of municipal clerks in Maine are in reviewing how they spend the money. And you want to make sure they fit those guidelines that Emma mentioned. And you may even want to adopt some sort of auditing function that, as Emma mentioned, and I know New York City is very active in, to make sure that what is said in the report is actually what they actually spent the money on. So those are all really key functions. And as you think about who's going to do what, and is there enough staff, and do the staff have the right professional backgrounds for this, you just need to keep all those accountability measures in mind.
That's great. Thank you. Both of you.
Of course.
And I am absolutely certain that the people of Portland are going to be in touch with you and have more information for you. So I am really thrilled that we have Amy Loprest here. Amy has been the executive director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board since September 2006. Ms. Loprest, Amy, is an active member of the Council on Governmental Ethics Laws, and she served as past president there. She clerked for Honorable Denise Cody, United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York, and was an adjunct professor of political science at Fordham University. And most importantly for tonight's webinar, she directs the largest municipal public funding program in the United States, I believe, and probably in the world. So we're so glad that you were able to be here, Amy. Really look forward to hearing from you this evening.
Well, thank you very much. And so we have a short a PowerPoint that I'm going to just let my press person put up, if we can. Thanks, Matt, for doing that. So again, I'm Amy Loprest. I'm the executive director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, and I'm really, really happy to be here to speak with you about our small dollar matching funds program. It's safe to say that the primary elections that were completed in New York City in June were the biggest in New York City in decades. And our financing program played a critical role in all aspects of that process. The headline of the election so far is that we have paid over an unprecedented $121 million to 306 candidates. That is with more than $45 million going to 9 candidates running for mayor. We had a record number of candidates running for city office this year, over 400. And once again, more than 90% of the candidates in the primary participated in the program. And that 80 to 90% is a pretty regular feature of our program. Now, again, and also we are looking, as Nick said, that we're a more diverse city council. It's looking that the New York City Council will be majority woman for the first time in history after the November elections. These eye-popping outcomes are not without, they were intentional. They're the direct result of changes to our program that were adopted in 2018 based on recommendations that we made after the 2017 election. Our own City Charter Revision Commission proposed changes to make our program more accessible, particularly for citywide candidates. And they did that by increasing the matching rate for small contributions, increasing the portion of contributions eligible for matchable payment to $250, and increasing the maximum public funds payment a candidate could receive for each election from 55% of the spending limit to about 89% of the spending limit. Without those changes, which were adopted by more than 70% of the citywide voters in a citywide referendum, these results wouldn't have happened. You know, we had seen in 2017 that it's particularly citywide candidates, while they had a lot of small donors because of the matching funds program, they still were getting the majority of their money from larger donations from larger donors. So just to compare this, our last biggest election, the previous record payment was $42 million, which was in 2001, which was the first year that term limits were in effect in New York City. So just to give you kind of an idea, what does this mean for this new system mean for city elections? New York City now has campaigns that are almost entirely based on public funding. So this chart is just an example. So it shows the differing funding models at the federal, state, and city levels for elections in one part of Queens. We took one city council district in Queens. And if you look at it, you can see that, you know, the representative from that part of Queens, most of their money comes from PACs and special interests or large donations. If you go to the far right, for the New York City council person, 88.9% of the money came from public funds. Another 10%, almost 11%, came from small donations. So really, all of the money in that city council election was from small donors or from the public, and that, you know, comparable. So while a House seat is much bigger than a city council, a comparable Senate seat is the same idea. About 2/3 of the money for a New York State Senate race in the same area, 72% of the money came from PACs or special interests. So, you know, before 2021, you know, this we had the same graphic, and we showed that small donations were the majority of where people got their money, and the new changes in the law really flipped the equation on its head, and the reliance on is now on public money and small dollars rather than any public at any special interest money like there is in the state and federal system. So I'm just going to give you some background on our program. So we're an independent, nonpartisan city agency created through a voter-approved referendum in 1988. So the first election that we ran our program in was 1989. We administer the Campaign Finance Act and the Campaign Finance Program. And our program is completely funded by New York City taxpayer dollars. We have multiple missions, which is really, you know, as Nick said, the public financing is to enable more citizens to run for office, strengthen the roles of small dollar contributors, reduce the potential for actual or perceived corruption. We also have additional mandates to provide campaign finance information to the public and also to increase voter participation and awareness. The New York City Campaign Finance Act covers 59 elected municipal offices. There are 3 citywide offices, 5 borough presidents, and 51 city council members. We have obviously establishes the voluntary campaign finance program. Like all public financing programs, our program is voluntary. It establishes contribution limits that apply to all candidates. It prohibits certain contributions. Basically, all corporate and business contributions are prohibited. And it also imposes stricter contribution limits on people who are pay to play. So people who have business dealings with the city. And we have a very, very broad definition of what is considered doing business with the city that those lower limits are imposed on. So why do this? I mean, like everyone else, what the purpose is to amplify the voice of New York City voters. We give $8 for every $1. As Nick said, that means that a $10 contribution to a candidate gives that candidate $90 to spend. This not only allows candidates to spend more time with the voters, it incentivizes them to spend more time with the voters because they can solicit these small dollar contributions, talk to the voters, and collect the money. And I'm sorry, am I echoing again? Okay. So when the candidates on the reverse side, since they're spending more time with the voters, they need to spend less time seeking support from large donors or special interests. It allows you to run a competitive campaign regardless of who you know or what your personal finances are. And also it sends a positive sign to voters because all the candidates, in addition to voluntarily agreeing to be in the public financing program, are voluntarily agreeing to spending limits at the same time. So, as I just said, candidates must abide by the contribution and spending limits. They need to meet a 2-part threshold to be eligible for public funds. That runs from 75, you need to get 75 contributions and $5,000 in matchable contributions from people in your city council district. You're running for city council. If you're running for mayor, you need to receive 1,000 contributions and $250,000 in matchable contributions in order to be eligible for public funds for mayor. You also need to disclose all of your expenditures and contributions fully, and you need to document your expenditures to demonstrate that public funds were spent to further your nomination and election to office. The CFB looks at documentation for every single contribution that we match before we match it. And we do an audit of every campaign that's received public funds fully to fully document that they've spent the public money appropriately. So, as I said before, the matching rate is 8-to-1, up to $250 for a citywide office, so up to $2,000 per contributor. For borough president and city council, the maximum matchable is $175 or $1,400 per contributor. And so, I mean, these numbers, we have a big city and the big expensive media market. So the maximum public funds are high. As I said, they're about 89% of the spending limit. They run from about $6.5 million for mayor to about $170,000 for a city council campaign. Contribution limits, which were reduced drastically with those changes from 2018. Before, the contribution limits for citywide offices was about $5,100. Now they are $2,000. For city council, they were almost $3,000, and now they are $1,000. As I said before, we prohibit most corporate kind of contributions, contributions directly from corporations, from partnerships and LLCs, unregistered political committees, and like almost every jurisdiction, anonymous or contributions that are made in the name of someone else. The spending limit, we have one, while the contribution limit applies across the entire election, primary and general, there is a separate spending limit for both the primary and general election, and it runs from about $7.3 million for mayor to $190,000 for city council. And then there are small limits for the out year, which are de minimis. So, one of our major missions is to provide public disclosure. And so, obviously there is the, here's all the contributors for a candidate. Here are the all of the expenditures that they've made. But we really strive to, to make it come to life, make that just information come to life for the public and the press. And so this is just an example of some of our public disclosure. If you see on the left, it's a map that we do for every, you can search for each candidate, you can search for each race to see where in the city they're getting their money. And you can see it's across, this is all races, all candidates, but you see there's contributions coming from everywhere in the city. Some of those only places where there's nothing are actual parks and there's nobody living there. It's like Central Park in Manhattan. But across the whole city, there are people giving contributions all across the city, which is a great result. And on the right-hand side is an example of our independent expenditure disclosure, where you can go to follow the money search and look actually at the materials that you got in the mail and see who they came from, who is behind them, who's contributing to that. They often, these independent spending entities have very innocuous names. You can look at who's actually making the contributions to those independent spending entities on our website. And finally, we are, a very important part of our mission is voter education and engagement. We print and mail a voter guide in 5 languages to every registered voter in New York City. It's also provided online, and also there are candidate videos. We run a debate program for citywide offices. We conduct voter registration drives. We are the agency that's charged with canvassing and giving nonpartisan get out the vote events. And also we are charged with producing an analysis of voter data every year, a report on how people voted in the preceding year. So, and again, anyone who has any questions, we're happy to help. You can contact our office.
Thank you so much, Amy. That is really an amazing operation you're running there. It's an interesting model that you've built up there over the years of successful administration. I really appreciate that. Let me just go directly now to René LeBeau. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Renee has worked for 20 years in election administration at the state, county, and local level out on the West Coast. Her work is focused on implementation, innovation, and compliance. In 12 years with King County elections, the largest vote by mail jurisdiction in the country, Renee directed efforts to significantly improve the time and cost of processing ballots while maintaining zero discrepancy elections for 8 years. So we're really delighted to have Renee here. We had originally scheduled Wayne Barnett, but Renee's stepping in, and we're eager to hear her description of the Seattle voucher program.
So I'm just going to blow through this presentation. So basically, this is a quick agenda. Our commission is an independent body within the city of Seattle. There are 7 volunteers who are responsible for the ethics, lobbying, whistleblower, codes within the city, as well as several reforms that came out of the Honest Elections Seattle initiative, including democracy vouchers, which is the one that I can speak to. Our commission is nonpartisan, and we are just independent, from the rest of the governing parts of the city. So the initiative was on the 2015 general election ballot in the city of Seattle, and it passed. And so it began in 2016, created a $3 million a year property tax levy that lasts for 10 years. So that is how the funding comes from. 2 basic goals of the program are to increase the number of people who are political donors in the city, and also to increase and have a representative group of people who are running for office. So who can use vouchers? So anyone in the city who is a city resident, over 18, and a citizen, a legal permanent resident, or a U.S. national can use democracy vouchers. So the majority of our users, we have a database of our users, comes from basically a simple voter file that we get from our local elections office, where I used to work. And also we have people who are not registered voters but are eligible can apply to receive democracy vouchers. And also campaigns can use democracy vouchers to help or most entirely fund their campaigns. Vouchers are optional for residents and candidates to use. Basics is how it works. I mentioned the funding source. How people get into our database is essentially becoming a registered voter or applying if you are not eligible to be a registered voter. The rates of registration are pretty high in the Seattle area, so we do capture quite a few people. We mail our vouchers in February, mid-February of our municipal election year, and then as people apply to get vouchers or they become newly registered, we request frequent updates. So we mail vouchers from February through whenever we close our doors, which is up until January. I call it like the little election that just goes on and on and on and on for months. So it is a constant, constantly sending things out. So we send them out to folks, paper packets, and at that point they can write in the name of the candidate who's using the democracy voucher program, put their signature on it and the date. They are provided with a postage paid envelope, and also they can hand them off to a candidate. What we have new as of 2019, which was our second cycle of using vouchers, is an online system, and we had around 10,000 or so people use democracy vouchers online in like 19, and now we're seeing about 25% of our users are going online. So this is great. They'll become kind of like paper-free, permanent online people. So once we get the vouchers into our office, the paper vouchers, we send them over to King County Elections and they check the signature just like a ballot. This is very much like a ballot. And then they come back to us with the determination. If there's an issue with the signature, we send them a letter, like we send the resident a letter asking them to follow up. If everything's good to go, we release the money to that campaign if they have become qualified at this point. If people aren't qualified, the candidate has not yet qualified, we hold that voucher in the system and just keep it ready to go. That's the basics of the function. So a little bit about what we're seeing this year, this election year. This was the first year that the mayor was eligible to use democracy vouchers. So this year we also have our city attorney and 2 of our city council at large are on the ballot. We have it every 2-year cycle. So in 2019, all of our 7 district council members were on the ballot. So this is really the first year we've had everybody with some sizable spending limits ready to go. So to date, we've mailed, I would say, right around 500,000 democracy voucher paper packets out to people. And we have over 41,000 residents have used their democracy vouchers. So we are already ahead of our 19 and way ahead of our 17 cycle. But a good number of them, anywhere from 20 to 25% of people are going online to portal to use their vouchers online. Okay, here's what the voucher mailer looks like so this is the outbound envelope. It's about the size of a mail ballot envelope that I'm familiar with. And this is our prepaid envelope, which is inside. Then the actual voucher mailer. So imagine that this is a 11 by 17 piece of paper. Each of these 4 vouchers is perforated so people can use them once, like all at once. They can assign them to a single candidate. They can assign a couple here, a couple there. They can assign, and we see this, 4 vouchers to 4 different mayoral candidates. Also, we've got a little just FAQ sheet. So what you don't see is on the back of this is the person's name, the resident's name, and also barcodes and numbers indicating their voter ID so the county can track it. We have an internal ID so that we can track it. And then each voucher has its own unique ID so that we can be accountable to every single voucher that we put money to. Should we, anybody ever ask? And no one's ever asked, but I have all that information waiting. Okay, what the candidates commit to if they choose to use democracy vouchers, spending limit. So our mayoral candidate spending limit was $800,000 total for the election year, and up to 400 of that for the primary, just to give you an example. The other three positions are at 375,000 total for the election. Candidates also agreed to individual lower contribution limits than non-program candidates for some of the races, and also to participate in public debates. So that's 3 debates that kind of meet a open to the public, accessible debate for ahead of the primary, and then also ahead of the general. And I can ignore those probably very old ones. Oh, so who's using vouchers? So this election, most of the general election candidates, 70% of them have chosen to use democracy vouchers. They're all qualified. They're all receiving money. In fact, one of them was already maxed out for the entire election year, and they maxed out before the primary was even over. And then we just had a mayoral candidate max out as well. And when I say max out, it's really a combination of they've reached that spending limit with a majority or with a combination of vouchers and private dollars. And that distribution, it varies significantly from candidate to candidate, but it is a growing portion of the overall monies that are coming into the election. So candidates qualifying, I've heard lots of familiar words, yay. Candidates to qualify do have to collect a certain number of minimum $10 contributions and signatures from Seattle residents. They can be from different people. Like I could collect $10 from one person and a signature. I could collect just a signature from someone who maybe doesn't have the money to give, but wants to support my access to the voucher program. All of these are audited. So we audit, just like some other jurisdictions we've heard, we do validate that the money has really come from a person, and also that that person was eligible, and also that the signature is validated. And that's, again, we use the elections office. And so a few things about so we're starting to look at some of the information about the users that we have access to, and one of them is date of birth. So in the first 2 cycles, we saw a fairly lower degree of participation among, I would say, like the lower half of the age groups. And we're starting to see this year that some of the, I would say, younger age groups are starting to use democracy vouchers at a higher rate. I think a number of things contributing to that: familiarity with the program, the mayoral races finally in the voucher program. We've got some community partners that we pay. We've got about a $250,000 budget for making grant monies. It's not truly grants, or contracts. And so we've got some focused on youth-oriented outreach. So those are participation by age. But another thing we look at, generally peek at to make sure we're not missing something significant, is just distribution of voucher users across the city. So previously, the monetary only style contributions were coming from the wealthier areas of the city that are fairly easy to view, you know, if you kind of know your city. But voucher users are they're coming from everywhere. They're coming from areas of the city that likely had no monetary donors. And so this is just the really exciting thing for me to see. We know of spikes in participation from some of our districts, because they tend to just have like a very high sort of engagement rate. And also the candidates were very exciting to this resident. So that was all I had, real basics about the voucher program, and I will.
One of the things that I'm taking away from all of these programs that I think is worth just putting a point on is each program requires showing some measure of public support. Each program requires candidates to observe restrictions on their spending. And each program allocates measured amounts of public funding incrementally to the candidates. There are other features in terms of asking candidates to do other things, but all of these things are things that you couldn't do make mandatory. These are all possible because these are voluntary programs, and the incentive for participation is the funding that's available to candidates. So it's a package of incentives and things that the candidates agree to that is common among all of them. So the question I would ask each of the three folks who represented their respective programs is if you kind of pull back to 30,000 feet and just say, what is something about the program that is really serves the public well, and that's really a good feature that you would recommend for consideration in the Portland Charter Commission or another jurisdiction that might be looking at public funding? What is an important feature of your program? Anybody want to speak to that?
I'm in my blurred
Well,
zone.
go ahead, Emma.
Let's go, Amy. Oh, Emma's going to go first, and then Amy.
Sure, thanks, Amy. So I think, as Jonathan alluded to earlier, that I truly think the Maine program has been so successful so long and has also been continued to be given support at the ballot box, as we saw at the expansion in 2015, is that we run a really, really tight ship as far as how everything is reviewed. The administration of it and making sure it is free of fraud and even, innocent mistakes that someone doesn't purposely do, but could still impact the reputation of the program. Overall, if you want the program to be successful, its reputation has to be good. And, there are avenues for fraud available if the administration isn't good enough. So to me, that's kind of the key thing, is making sure that the administration of the program is run as a really tight ship, and there's a thorough review process in place before the actual program begins, or that candidates can participate in it.
Amy?
Well, I think that, I think it's no coincidence that all three of these programs are governed by independent, nonpartisan boards. And I think that that's an important feature of our administration. That's from 1,000 feet. I mean, that's a big, two other things is, again, the rigorous auditing. I mean, you're right. It's not like picking up the trash, like you don't have to do it. And so, if there were, if there were scandals, there would be a problem. So rigorous, so that the public and the candidates have confidence in the program. And finally, one feature of our program that I would highly recommend is built into our law is a mandate that we review and make recommendations for changes to the law. So our law has changed significantly since when it was passed in 1989. And that is largely because of our, our recommendations and our work with both the City Council and various charter revision commissions over the years.
Thank you, Amy. René, you want to venture anything on vouchers?
Well, I really support what the other panelists have said. I think those are really significant for us as well. I think the thing about the voucher program is you don't have to have any money to use it. So it costs a lot to mail it out. It costs a lot to process, but the opportunity for somebody to engage when they literally cannot spare a dime is something we do hear from residents. So, whether starting at $100 was the way to start, that is just what was written into the initiative. But I just do hear from residents that they never would have engaged otherwise.
Nick, are you tempted to venture an observation on this one? You're on mute.
There you go. Yeah, a couple things. In Seattle, I know you ran through this, René, but I think the outreach efforts to make sure that the communities that are participating less understand the program and might participate more in that ongoing targeted education work seems to me to be really important. And especially since everybody gets a voucher, it's just different. You have this money in your hands to give, but if you're outside the political system, how would you even know what it's for or whatever? So I know you've done a lot of work on that, and I think that is, ultimately going to be really important to leveling up the sort of marginalized communities and using the system. And I think that's a long-term thing, but I know you guys are paying attention to. And Amy, what you said about the New York system changing over the years, when I first came into this stuff in the early 90s, New York was doing a 1-to-1 match on 1,000, right? And just the differences in what you see happening. So the ability to change and get more focused, I think, is really amazing. Rather than being set in your ways, it's just that change, being more and more focused about the equity parts of it, seemed to have really paid off. And in Maine, one of the things I remember the most was one year, I think working with Anna, we did a look at polling the candidates. So we had some of our staff help folks in Maine call candidates to find out what they thought of the system. And the number of people who said, oh yeah, whenever I couldn't figure things out, I had this friendly person I could call at the state agency to do it. And so that kind of, I guess, customer service for the candidates, I think helps a lot, because we both want to be there if they're doing something wrong, to go get them and stop it. But I think even just as important, or maybe more important, is getting in with them so they do it the right way, and aren't constantly, having technical violations of the system, which put everybody in a difficult position. So those are three things about that have stuck with me through the years in each of these different systems.
Well, let me ask the question this way. The programs could aspire to, establish spending limits on campaigns, have more of a grassroots, voter-centered democracy. They could aspire to do any one of a number of things, including returning to the discussion of issues more than on campaign fundraising in general. Do you think that your programs that you're running are meeting those high goals that were set out by the people who launched the respective programs?
But I just want to say, I think that the biggest public objective that our program pursues and achieves is the number of people who say, I would never run for office without public funding. I don't like to fundraise. And I know that our legislative caucuses often say to me, we go to people, we actively recruit people to run for the Maine legislature. And we hear so often, well, I'm not really experienced in fundraising. I don't know how. Then both political parties will go to that person and say, well, we have a public financing program here and it's taken care of. Not that it's that easy, but there's qualifying and hoop jumping and everything, but objection, taken care of. And I think with candidate recruitment and just getting people involved, it's been a big boost.
And I will echo that. I mean, we hear that all the time from, people who, who said that they would never have been able to run successfully, including, Republican candidates, including the first African-American woman who's been elected to statewide office. She originally ran as a public financing candidate for city council. She said she never would have been able to run for office, even starting in that city council campaign without the public financing. And, we do, our candidate services people do outreach and throughout the community to try and engage people across the city who don't, to learn about the program. We have a special training that's called New to the CFB, which is just like sort of, what it means candidate kind of basic training. And I think that the proof is that, it's always across, political sciences say that, women raise less money. It's harder for them to run for office, whatever the reason is. But the fact that we are going to probably most likely have a majority female city council for the first time is really evidence that we are reaching people who would otherwise not run for office.
Great. And I want to make sure that any of our Charter Commission members or Elections Committee members have a chance to ask questions too. So if you have a question, you feel free to put that in the chat. We do have a question specifically about Seattle, but I think it could tie into other states and be interested in your reaction to this. Vouchers are not limited to US citizens, but also nationals and permanent residents in Seattle. Does that inclusion extend to actual voting on a local level in Seattle?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
No.
Does anybody else, I guess the voucher, the matching in New York, the contributor, does that person need to be a New York City voter?
The contributors, to get matching funds, they have to be a New York City resident, but they don't have to necessarily be a voter. They do have to be a citizen, but New York City is actually in the process of considering a law that would allow non-citizens to vote on a local level. I mean, that's just being considered just now.
Do you know whether that proposal would carry over to allow those people to trigger matching funds?
It doesn't right now, that piece of legislation.
Yeah. Another question, Renee, I think you referred to maxing out before the general election. Can you just elaborate on what does it mean for a candidate to max out before the general election?
Yeah, so the city council person who maxed out early, they had a $375,000 overall limit, for the election as a whole. And before the primary election had even taken place, they had already received that number of vouchers that we were holding in our database. So basically enough vouchers had come in before they were even voted into the primary, which wasn't until the 1st of August. They had already got enough vouchers kind of banked to where they could immediately receive the full amount for the general election. So after the primary election, and it was determined that they were moving forward, they were one of the top 2 candidates, I was ready to release a check for exactly half of the entire amount they could get for the general. So like $187,500. I was ready to go. It was so early, it was amazing. So anyway, that's what maxing out means. It just means they can't get any more vouchers. And they have to get released if they want to go over that limit. They have to get request release from the commission.
And is there an ultimate maximum that they can spend?
There are. So it's either $800,000 for the mayor or $375,000 for the other 3 positions on the ballot. Unless there's oppositional spending in excess of that, they can request release from the limits, and then they would private fundraise. There would be no more democracy vouchers after that.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, Nick.
I think one elephant on the table in all these systems now is the independent expenditures, because the court has said you can't do any of that. So you sort of have a regulated system that might include public financing and contribution limits. And then you have an unregulated system, which plays alongside in parallel. And, I think brings back a lot of the other issues. I would say that watching this happen, the benefits of the public financing system still exist. So you're not in a situation where those voices are drowned out. You're not also, the original Maine system, basically there were tighter laws around IEs and there was additional matching funds if someone spent money against you, and then the court said, no, you can't do that. I mean a different kind of matching fund. If your opponent spends more than your limit, you'd receive a check, right? They had that in Arizona also, and in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. So watching these systems, once that policy provision is removed and seeing IEs climb much more, I think it impacts the system because you can't keep the big money down, but you can match it. And what happened in the last cycle in Seattle, I think showed the worth of the system in the face of IE funding from, I think, the largest corporation in the world, right? Amazon, if not that among them, right? A company worth, I think, $1 trillion or something, said, oh, we want to play. And $1 trillion in equity, I forget what the 10-year funding levy is for the system, but Amazon could blink and spend that if they wanted to. So, but it backfired. And so that has made me feel like the systems can stand up to this, but they have to have ample resources, even in the grants or releasing people to raise more relatively small contributions. So, but this still allows candidates to get a start and prove themselves and get their wheels spinning and run a really good campaign that will be competitive. A friend of mine in Seattle, who's a consultant, I said, so why did they think they'd spend enough to win? He said, no, they couldn't buy anything else. He said there was nothing left to buy in terms of online advertising, stuff like that would get to Seattle voters. So I thought that was a pretty good test, and it withstood it. Only I think one of the people backed by the Amazon money won, and that person was also backed by all the other groups that were, really engaged.
So sticking with the Northwest, and it's kind of like fire in line for Renee, but I have another question for you. Was the outreach funding that you utilized, was that written into the original law, or was that something you determined to use on your own as part of your budget?
It was not in the original initiative. I wish it had been. Not that there was any fight getting it. It was none at all. So the original initiative drafted by advocates and actually Nick probably knows more about those folks than I do. So it very much spoke to getting people into the process who haven't previously been in the political process, getting a more representative, group of candidates. It required a minimum number of languages. So it specified at that time the languages that met kind of like a tier category for the city. We have since added languages. So originally, I think it was 14, and now we're at 18 total. And that's for all key documents. So that being written in there, it gave, and again, not that I have ever needed leverage with Executive Director Wayne Barnett or the commissioners to do the good things, right? To do the right things. But I've been able to say to an IT group who's building our online portal, you need to meet the language requirements. I'm like, oh, well, we'll just get the English ones out first. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. And now you're no longer a vendor. Okay, like now you're done. So it's a hammer. It's been great to have. But the contracts though. So the first year, we had a wonderful advisory committee. We had a lot of support. And then the second year, we realized we wanted a more formal opportunity to pay the trusted messengers for the work that they were already doing to a degree on our behalf. And we started with I think $120,000 total in budget, not nearly enough. Went up to 200 and I think it's around 250 or so this year, but these can be small, like $5,000 amounts. They can be like $30,000 kind of campaigns that are like more but resident engagement campaigns, part of other things. And it's still challenging. And then COVID came and it was just, we're all having a challenge. So did that help? Did I answer the question? So I would write in engagement. I would write in candidate training. We built candidate training during the quarantine, a bunch of videos that we just put together, because you're inviting new people into the system. You're inviting people to become donors. You're inviting people to run for office, and they really don't know. And I try to convince them this just being in the voucher program, it's not going to make you win. You still have to go out there and win. Can
I make a comment about something that Nick said about the independent expenditures? Because, I think that's, an important point. I mean, that is, we're living with the Supreme Court and the Constitution and, and what they've said about what can be done. And I think that I would like to make 2 points. Is that one is that because we're a matching program, candidates can raise more than, in these small dollar contributions. then they can get matched for, because there's a maximum amount. So they have the money, and we in our program we do have if you facing a high spending non-participant, we'll lift the spending limit for you, either raise it by 50% or raise it completely, depending on how much money your opponent spends. But the other thing we've also seen is that, we've been getting independent expenditure disclosure for several elections now, and we have not seen the value or impact of independent spending. Like, there's a lot of spending. Don't get me wrong, a lot of money has been spent by these independent actors, but we don't really see that those translate into votes. And I think that the public money and the small contributions, the candidates are very able to get their message out and communicate with voters. And I think sometimes those independent efforts backfire.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm sure that's happening in a variety of other jurisdictions. Let me put one more question out there and then turn it over to Anna. As Portland starts to look into this, do you have any advice on how to start figuring out the math of how much to offer candidates to run a competitive race?
Yeah, sorry.
No, just what would you start looking at?
I was actually thinking about this earlier today, and it might be because I'm also a Portland resident, so I was also just thinking out of simple curiosity. I think there's kind of two main factors you need to look into, and firstly is some research needs to be done to figure out what is the average amount of spending on the types of races that would be publicly funded, because for the program to be successful, the candidates have to be competitive. So for instance, if I don't think this is the case, but let's say if, for a school board race, let's say the average spend was 10,000, if the public financing program at max gives them 3,000, hardly anyone's going to participate. So I think there's firstly doing some historical research and coming up with some averages. And then it's also looking at the size of the districts. I personally think for Portland, it would make sense to look at what our payments to the state house, the house, state rep and the state Senate candidates look at, as far as basically dollars per constituents in the district, because that is somewhat what the main values are based on, and then kind of extrapolate that to Portland, I think would be two really key factors in that equation to figuring out the payment amounts.
Great, thank you, Emma.
Can I add one?
Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
I agree with what Emma said. I think looking at the actual numbers, the one sort of extension I'd make, or two, one is that, the standard the advice we used to give is you want a sort of rational campaign manager to look at this system and say to their candidate, I would advise you to take this system, right? It isn't about candidates being more pro-democracy than other candidates. It's about every candidate looking at it and saying, hey, this makes sense. And I think one of the things we would look at is look at all the data, but say, if you maxed out on your public funds, could you get to, if you maxed out, would that put you in the top rank of candidacies? It doesn't have, you want to throw out the very, the self-spenders and the Uber fundraisers, but say, could we, do 90% of the candidates get to this level, or not get to it, but the 90th percentile? We want to reach almost all the candidates and throw out the real outliers. So that was one sort of piece of advice. Could you have a robust competitive campaign against a well-financed outsider? A person who's not using the system. That was one piece. And then the other is hang with the campaign managers, right? And the fundraisers, and say, if you had this much money, do you think you could win, right? And would that be an incentive to advise your candidate to be in the system, even if they're a relatively strong fundraiser? The one thing I'd be wary of in those conversations, if they've never raised small donations, they might not have any idea what it would take, and they may not be a good person to find out. But at the federal level, certainly there are plenty of candidates now who are running and raising small donations. There are a lot of digital fundraising managers. There's a lot more knowledge about raising small contributions than there used to be. But sort of the people knowledge, and then what the numbers say, and then talk it up.
Thanks, Nick. And with that, I'm going to pass to Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been so educational for me, even though I think about this stuff all the time. And I hope that for folks who are getting into the weeds of this for the first time, that it was as informative. I'm sure that everyone on the panel is happy to follow up with charter commissioners and to make yourselves available for future advice. And it just strikes me, again, listening to all of you, just how important the administrators of these programs are, and having those, not just for all of the very important accountability reasons that you all laid out, but also for the comfort and familiarity of both the public and the candidates. I know when I was running, I was probably the most paranoid candidate that Emma's ever had to deal with, because I was so sure that I was going to make some horrible mistake accidentally and have to leave the state in shame. But Emma was very patient with me and helped me figure out how not to turn a $3 bank fee into a violation, and it was great. And seeing the wonderful maps that New York is doing and that independent disclosure and the outreach that you're doing in Seattle is really, really inspiring. And I'm excited to think on what on a Portland scale is possible, not just the program itself, but in the way that it is administered, and how we can make it be a program that Portland can really embrace and be proud of. I wanted to say, for those of you who are listening who are not on the Charter Commission, to be aware that the next meeting next Tuesday, the 21st, is when Clean Elections is coming up on the agenda. And I will stick in the chat, hopefully for everyone, that the agenda for that, and we encourage folks to attend that, give public comment, think about which of these systems you think Portland should have, and tell the Charter Commission. Everyone, the Charter Commission's emails are available through the city as well. And that if there's anyone data-minded out there who would like to help us with our project of putting all of those handwritten documents that were then scanned into PDFs that are currently where all of the city of Portland's campaign finance data lives, we are trying to turn those into a database to do the kind of analysis that Emma was mentioning. And we could use some more people who are willing to do some transcription with us. So I will just throw that out there as well, if anyone's interested in volunteering with MCCE on that. But with that, I just want to say thank you again to the fantastic panelists, to our charter commissioners, for the citizens of Portland who are showing up to make all of this possible. It is just so exciting to be able to actually think about the policy and what's possible for us.